Welcome back, everybody. We are working on the waffle box. We have some pretty awesome drop-down menus that we have developed, and we added keyboard support to them, including the escape key as well as arrow navigation, which is all working really well at this point. In this lesson, we're going to do some refactoring. This is going to be fun. So I part of the reason why our toggle script right here, part of the reason why it's starting to get a little long and starting to get a little messy is because this is a class. So we start out basic and we kind of incrementally add things to it. And that has created sort of a Frankenstein. Also, another part of the reason is because the class is a little bit off the cuff. My educational style could be more planned, I guess you could say. We just kind of mess around with stuff and see where we go. And there's a loose plan in place. So don't fear not for that. I do have a place, an end goal I want to get you guys to. But nonetheless, I'm definitely not copying and pasting from something I've already written. It's more or less we're just kind of trying to explain certain topics and certain very important features of our interactive components that we're building as we're going through it. But I think the issue is, as you can see here, just like look at these options. Like we basically started out in the very beginning of when we had this class with just an ATTR, a toggle container, and a toggle class, and that was it. But like one lesson at a time, we added like one or two more options, and now we have all this stuff inside of this toggle class. And if you scroll down and just take a look at the toggle method in particular, like look how much stuff it does. Like that's just too much. It just is. So if we were architecting this and like starting from the beginning and saying, hey, we're going to build a toggle with all these different features in it, we probably wouldn't have done it like this. I think this is really just it's the victim of being as a part of a class where I had to explain things one at a time. But we're at a point now where it's starting to get messy. And generally the rule of thumb that I like to follow is that each method in a class or each function that you write or method or whatever, you should be able to explain what it does in a very, very brief statement. So you should be able to say, in this case, the toggle method toggles a target. Toggle a target element, right? But what it's actually doing is it's checking to see that it's not a toggle button. It's getting the button. It's getting the target. It's checking to see if it's toggled. Then we're doing expand only. Then we're toggling the target. And then we're collapsing siblings. And then we're updating the state and setting on toggle event. And that's way too much. Like if you have to explain what it does and it takes that long, that means we could probably refactor. So I think we're long overdue for this. Some of you guys that might have been into the whole let's write some really clean, nice-looking JavaScript. This might be driving you crazy the way we're doing this. But fear not, for we are going to fix it. We're going to make it better. We're going to improve this quite a bit. And we're going to basically take a lot of this code. We're going to make it more reusable, kind of divide it up into smaller parts so that we can have individual methods on this class that really just focus on a single thing. And not only that, but I think it's really important to have really good documentation as well. So we're going to spend a little bit of time just in this lesson, basically just going through this and essentially redoing our toggle. And we're not going to add any new functionality, so it's maybe not the most exciting thing, but I think refactoring is so important. Like having good, clean code and having methods that are easy to follow is just going to make this so much easier to use, especially if you hand it off to another developer. If you're working in a team, people are going to see all the methods and all the properties on this class whenever you instantiate it, and they're going to say, oh, that makes sense. There's a blur method, and there is a, dismiss siblings method or whatever we end up doing where, we might take a little piece like expand only or whatever and separate it out. It's just going to be so much easier if that cannot be all stuffed into this one mammoth toggle method, but rather be separated out a little bit. And you actually find later, in later lessons, when we get into some things like modals, this is actually going to benefit us quite a bit because we're going to want to use the pieces that we separate out in this lesson in order to improve our other web interactions that we're going to build, including that modal, which we'll do very, very soon. So that being said, I'm going to start with some good documentation because I think autocomplete is so important. It's actually one of the reasons why I really like TypeScript. I hated TypeScript the first time I saw it, and I was like, oh, this is awful. It's like forced documentation is what it feels like. Yeah, I have to type these variables, and it frustrated me. But now when I write JavaScript, like regular old JavaScript, like you see here. I really miss it. So the best thing to do if you're a TypeScripty person and you like those types and stuff is just to add the JS doc stuff. So you notice in some of these methods I had you in previous lessons, I had you do things like add this JS doc block here where it's like param mouse event E, and where basically it's kind of like in TypeScript how you would type the event here. Like I can hover over it and I get the type up in my tooltip here. We can do the same thing with basically everything inside of this method. So that's going to be the first thing I want to do is I want to take all these options because we have way too many now. I'm going to sort them alphabetically first of all, so they're a little bit easier to navigate and easier to look through. And I'm going to take all of these options that we've created, and we're going to create a type definition for the toggle options. And that's pretty easy to do. We're going to come down to the bottom of the file, very bottom of the file, and I'm just going to do a JS doc block. That's fun to say, JS doc block. And we'll create a type definition for component configuration options. And you do this using type def, and then you give it the type of JavaScript object. So our options are actually an object that contain a bunch of properties, and then we give it a name. And I'll just call this options. Let's just call it a type definition of options, and then we can give it a bunch of properties. So right, like property, string, blah. Like, so that way your options, you have a blah option and you put it in there. And so that's basically how you do a type definition, but I have a bunch of cursors here so we can, let me make a bunch of lines here so that I can paste all those in without having to go back and, there we go. I actually had the right amount of cursors. I didn't even count. That's awesome. So for each one of these, what we're going to do is we're going to say property, and then there'll be some type. Let's just put in string because I think most of them are strings, and then we'll have to go back and change it. And then we'll have a description over on the right. And that's basically the format of a type definition. Let's take these out down here. And this is pretty cool because once I set all this up and I add the descriptions and all the types and stuff, I'll be able to say this.config dot, and the autocomplete will contain all of these descriptions and all of the nice documentation that I'm writing for these configuration options for this component. So I think this is going to be really boring to watch because I'm just writing text. And that's not very exciting, is it? So what I'm going to do is I'll probably speed up the video here real quick, and I'll finish all these. I'll just add descriptions to all these and type them according to their type, and then I'll stop the sped up video and kind of explain what we did. So let's get started with that. Okay, I think that's going to do it. So what we did is we added the types. So you can see I typed them with like string and Boolean for most of these properties for this options type definition. We added descriptions to each one of those to give us a little bit more info about that. I also, because our onToggle event is a callback, I added this extra section down here in JS doc. You can do a callback. So I defined a callback called onToggle, which defines its parameters, as well as which include the button, the target, and is toggled. So that's just going to give us some nice IntelliSense for that. And now that we've done this, check this out. So again, this type definition is options. What I can do up here, above the options, first of all, we can say, we can add a JS doc block for toggle component configuration, and we can add a type of options. And that's pretty cool because now that we've typed that, check this out. In any of our methods down here, like if I just go down in it, I can say this.config dot, and then check out all this cool stuff, right? I can, let me go up to the top here. I can arrow through all my different options. So I can say, well, what's key escape? It's enable keyboard toggle escape. That's pretty cool, right? So all those descriptions, all that documentation is now sort of permeating throughout the application, which is great. But I also want to type it when we instantiate this, because another place where these options are really important is right here. And you'll see right now, like for example, if I wanted to do the, I don't know, the key escape, I don't have any autocomplete here, right? It's not popping up and telling me what the options are when we're instantiating that. And so what I can do is up here, we can add a JS doc block and the constructor. And so we'll say parameter is going to be options, component configuration options. And instantiate a new toggle will be this. And then usually it's a good idea anytime you have a method on a class to specify a return type, even if it's void. In this case, we're actually returning the instance of this. So this will return a toggle. And then now I can see over in app.js, check this out. If I type in key, I get key escape, key navigation. I get that really nice IntelliSense, which is great. So definitely a good idea to add JS doc documentation to just about everything, to be honest. Like I could add just a very simple description up here. We could scroll down to our initialize component and we could change that to a JS doc block. We could say initialize component, return void. So even if it doesn't return anything, you can explicitly specify that it returns void. And then it's just going to improve your IntelliSense everywhere. Because if I ever need to call this.init, I can, like for example up here, I can immediately see in the tooltip, oh, that's going to return void, and it's initializing the component. It's just a really, really nice feature to add to, especially to your component classes that you're developing. And especially if you were to do something like publish this out to NPM, it's going to allow people that are importing this package or your components that you've developed into their solutions, but they're going to get really good IntelliSense without having to rely on some elaborate documentation that you provide. You should still provide documentation. I think that's really important, and this never eliminates the need for that, but it's so helpful. So it's so good to do this, so much more helpful to any developers to just be able to get that autocomplete and that IntelliSense right inside of their code editor. So let's continue to improve this. As I mentioned, we're going to refactor a bit. So I think the next thing I want to do now that we have sort of set up our JS docs stuff is we can start to pluck pieces out of this toggle method and try to figure out how we can make them more flexible, more portable, and really focus on a single thing at any given time. So first of all, I know that one thing that we're doing here, basically the first thing that we're doing after we handle this toggle thing is, we're checking to see it's not a toggle button. We're preventing the default click. And then the main thing we're doing here is we're getting the button, and then we're getting the toggle target. I think this method in particular right here is a great candidate to separate out into its own method, because then later, if I want to get a toggle target from a blur method or from some other method I create on this class, if we have this separated out and reusable where I can just say, hey, here's a button, go find me the target, then that's going to be a really nice way to sort of single that out and make that into its own method that we can then abstract. And you don't have to worry about all this .closest, .query selector stuff in here. And this toggle method, we can separate that out into its own thing. And so what we'll do is up above here, right below our initialize method, our init method, let's create a get target method. And that's going to accept a button parameter. And then I usually like to write the JS doc before. This is normally how I would actually start developing a method, is because this is kind of how I can work it out in my head, and then you have it documented and you can go back there. But just as an example, I want this to take an HTML element called button. That's going to be the parameter it takes, and that's going to be the toggle button from which to begin traversal, right? Because this is basically a traversal method. We're finding the target. And I also want it to return an HTML element because we're finding a target element in this case. And then the description for this is just going to be find toggle target from given toggle button. And now that we have that nice JS documentation up here, I kind of have a clear picture in my head as to exactly how this is going to work. And given a button element, I can first of all get the toggle container. So I can say const container equals button.closest this.config.toggle container. And then if you don't have it, if the container is not found, so if container is falsy, meaning that this .closest method returned null, then we'll immediately return null. And this is kind of one of the benefits of separating these methods out, is it makes it a little more clear. Like, we didn't really do any like checking before. We just kind of assumed in our script that we were always going to be able to find the closest toggle container, but that's not necessarily true, right? If somebody doesn't configure their attribute correctly or their component correctly, then this will sometimes fail. So by separating these methods out, it's going to make it a lot easier to kind of add these little checks to make sure your project is less error prone as well. But let's go ahead, and once we have the container, we'll get the toggle target. And just like we did in the method down below, if you scroll down here, you'll see we get the closest container, which we just did, and then we use a query selector on the buttons, and I'll just copy this, the buttons get attribute this.config.attr. So that'll be return container dot. Let me fix the spelling of that there. So we're getting the toggle target, and again, we're returning it. So you'll notice if I hover over query selector, in this case, it's actually returning an HTML element, which could be null as well. So that's another thing to consider, is that this could actually return null, because you could either, if the container is not found, it'll return null, or if this query selector doesn't find anything, that will actually return null as well. And this is pretty cool, because now that we have separated this code out, we've sort of abstracted it. Every time we need to find a toggle target from a button, we can simply call this method and it's going to take care of it. Its logic is in one place, it's easy to maintain, and this method has a single function. Like, it's really easy to describe what this method is doing, right? We're getting the container and then we're getting the target. That's all it does, and it returns that target. And that's what you want out of your class methods, especially once you get to this point and you've really added a lot of complexity to this. This is going to be such an easier way to sort of deal with this stuff. So now that we've created this get target thing, let's come down here, and instead of saying target is all this junk, we'll just say target is equal to this.get target button. And that's all we have to do, right? And then it's going to work the exact same it did before. So when I save and I come over here, everything's going to work just the same. We just sort of abstracted all that messy code that was over here. We abstracted it into this.get target custom method. And now if we need to reuse that functionality somewhere else in our class, it's sort of separated, it's in its own method, and I don't have to copy code, which is certainly preferable. All right, so another thing that in particular I know we're doing more than once inside of this class is, if you scroll down here, we have this idea of getting the active buttons, right, within some container. So in the case of our single options, when we have this.config.single enabled, we did this thing where we got the single container and then we collapsed the siblings within the single container using this, this selector right here, where we're selecting aria expanded equals true things. But you'll notice if I scroll down, we're using that again in the blur method. We're just running it on the document in that case. So there's another instance where we're getting all of the active buttons. And we're even using it again in the key down method. And this time we're doing it within the toggle container. And we're doing that same sort of query selector all. So that's another great candidate to sort of remove and put into its own method on this class. So I'm going to copy this query selector all, because we'll just copy that into its own method. We'll come up here below our get target and we'll create a method. We call this get active buttons. And this is going to get the active buttons in some container. But again, the container may change, because one of the places we use this, it gets it inside of the single container. Another place it gets it in the the toggle container, and another place gets it in the whole document. So maybe what we'll do is we'll just set a default value on this, an ES6 default value. It'll look like this. So we could set it to document by default. So it'll select it from everywhere. And then once we're in here, we'll just simply return container.querySelector all this. Right? That's all this method has to do, is just take whatever container you specify, or if you don't specify a container, use the document and get all of the active buttons. And now we can write our JS doc in here. So this is going to be an HTML element container, which is going to be the toggle container in which to search for active buttons. In which. And actually, it's not necessarily a toggle container. So we'll call this an element container in which to search for active buttons. And the description of this will be get active toggle buttons within given container. And we will return, and you'll notice this query selector all, you see there, it actually returns node list of with an assertion of element. And there's some overrides for that, so it can return a couple different things. And that's like a TypeScript sort of syntax there with the weird brackets, but basically it returns a node list of, and then you can more specifically give it a type of, like, what type of node does it return? What type of node list? Well, it's actually going to return a list of HTML elements in this case. So now I can see when I hover over this, it actually returns a node list of HTML elements, and that's going to be really helpful anywhere we use this method because, again, the IntelliSense and the autocomplete are going to know exactly the type of element that is returned from this method. And now that we've created this, everywhere where we're trying to do this query selector all array expanded equals true thing, let's just use this get active buttons thing right here. And so we'll scroll down to where we do our single thing, and we will simply say, instead of single container.query selector all this stuff, we will say this dot get active buttons in the single container. And then we can delete all this stuff, and then that just kind of cleans up this section a little bit more, doesn't it? And we're going to do the same thing as we scroll down here. So right here we're doing document.query selector all. So that can simply be this.get active buttons, and we'll accept the default, which is you can see the question mark here indicates container is optional. That's because, again, the container is going to be document by default. So we'll just not pass a parameter in that case. And then finally, the last place we were doing that was down here. We were searching the toggle container for expanded buttons. So we'll replace this with this.query selector, this.get active buttons toggle container, like so. And then as long as we did everything right, everything, yet again, is going to continue to work just as it did before. And I would say there's probably a good use case to sort of abstract out this whole get Focusables data. This is probably a good idea just because it's really going to clean up this key down method, which really shouldn't be focused on this very specific task. So let's take this content as well, and let's cut that out. And then we'll come back to this and fix it. It's going to freak out because these variables haven't been initialized yet. But what we'll do is we'll place that in its own method as well. So let's go back up here. A lot of scrolling in this episode, sorry. We'll create a method on the class called get Focusables. And that's going to accept, let's see what this code actually does. So we're going to want to accept a container, as well as you'll see here we're using e.target, which we don't have in this context. So we can just say, let's say this is going to accept a current focus element. And then in the JS doc, we'll make sure the container is an HTML element, which will be the container in which to query for Focusables. Query. And then the current focus is going to be the currently focused element. And that will be not HTML elements, but HTML element. There we go. And the description will be get Focusables and focus index within given container. So for the return for this, what this method actually needs to return is, if you remember down below, not only did we sort of need to have the Focusables node list itself, but also the current focus index. So actually what I want to do when I return this is I want to return like an object that contains the Focusables and the focus index together. So we can call this focus data, if you will. So I actually want it to return both of those things as an object. And I could say return object, but you're not really going to get good IntelliSense from that because an object is any old object in JavaScript. It's not really specific. What we could do is, yet again, we could create a type definition for this data right here. So we could say, hey, for the focus data type, that is going to contain a Focusables and a focus index. And that's just going to give us better IntelliSense. So yet again, we'll go to the very bottom of our file here, and let's do a focus data type definition. So we'll do type def, and whoops, we got to move this over a little bit like so. So this will be type definition object focus data. And that's going to have a property, which is going to be a node list of HTML elements. And that's going to be called Focusables. So that's our Focusables property in the object we're returning, which will be Focusable elements. And then we'll also have a property of type number that's going to be the focus index, current focus index. And now that we've created a type definition for focus data, I can now use that as a type in my JSDoc definitions. So if we go back up, all the way up here, we can say it doesn't return an object, it returns focus data. And you'll see when we actually use this in a moment, that's going to be really, really nice, because when we call this method, we're going to get this object back, but our IntelliSense is going to allow us to say, you know, take whatever we got back, and I know that it has a .focusables, and that's a node list of HTML elements. And I know it's going to have a .focus index, and that's a number. But we do need to fix this up a little bit because we are renaming these variables a little bit, so it's actually called container, and instead of e.target, it's actually called current focus. And I think that should do it for our get focusables method here. That is now nicely separated and created in its own sort of isolated method. And now let's actually use this. So it's going to do get focusables. Let's go back down to where we took that out, and we'll say get focus data, const focus data equals this dot get focusables. And you can see in the IntelliSense, we get some nice stuff here. So I can say, hey, what container do you want to search in? And what is our current focus? Well, I want to search in the toggle container, just like we did before. And the current focus is going to equal e.target because we're in a key down method. So e.target is always going to equal whatever has the current focus. And now that I have this, check out this IntelliSense. Focus data dot. And then if I go all the way to the top here, how do you scroll to the top? Maybe the page up. Yeah, page up button. There we go. So we have focus index and focusables. And you can see they have types, right? So if I say .focusables dot, it knows that it's a node list. So I immediately get my IntelliSense for things like the .for each, .keys, .length, etc. All that stuff is going to permeate throughout the application because I've typed all this stuff, which is really, really great in my opinion. You may not love this. You may not love having to write all this extra documentation, but I got to tell you, especially when you start sharing this stuff with the outside world and with other developers, that's when it's so important and it's so useful. And it's going to save you a lot of headaches in the end because people will actually be more able to understand the code that you actually wrote. If it's a project where it's all just like your brainchild and it's in your head, maybe not as useful because you can write a comment that says, you know, something silly and that will remind you of what you did, and it doesn't necessarily have to make sense to everybody else. But this is like a nice standard way to provide typing and nice documentation and IntelliSense to people that are going to use your code, and that's especially when you're going to find this is useful. But anyway, now that we have this focus data, we can say not focus index, but focus data dot focus index, and that's going to give us our current focus index. And then the next focus index is going to equal focus data dot focusables dot length, in this if statement, we're going to check that. And then likewise, let's put this on its own line. We'll put focus data dot focusables focus like so. And let's just double check that our keyboard arrows are still working just fine. So all that is nicely separated out. It's looking much better, and we removed quite a bit of code from our key down method down here. All right, so I think there's maybe one other thing I want to do before we sort of finish wrapping up this refactoring, if you will. So certainly, I think this is a good candidate for separating out into a separate method. You can easily describe like what this does. This is collapsing sibling toggles, right? So that probably shouldn't belong in this method. It's its own thing. Like if you can describe what it does, and that's probably its own method. So if we say this is how you collapse sibling toggles, then let's just take all this stuff, let's cut it, and we'll move it into its own method, and that's really going to clean up this toggle method right here. So let's go up here. We'll do sort of the same thing we've been doing. Let's call this dismiss siblings, and that will accept a button parameter. And once again, we will go ahead and add our JS doc thing. So that's going to take an HTML element button, which will be the sibling toggle button. And I don't think this returns anything. So this will simply return void. And the description will be dismiss all sibling toggles. So we're going to take our button. We're going to find the single container, just like we were before, using button.closest. That's why we need to have a button to start traversal to find this single container. And then down here, we can probably shorten this line a bit. We will do the same thing we were doing before, where we're getting the active buttons inside of the single container. And then for each of those active buttons, we're going to invoke a click here. And that's going to do our dismiss sibling. So we've nicely separated this out. Now let's go down here and we'll simply say this.dismiss siblings button. And we can even put that on its own line. And look how much that shortened up this toggle method. Like, that's so much better. Hopefully you agree. And then now let's just see, we do have the single option on here, and it looks like that is working fine. That's great. I feel so much better about this, guys. This has kind of been driving me crazy for the past few lessons because we added so much stuff to this toggle class, and I wanted to fix it, but I didn't know if it was the right time. I think this is the right time. This is good. So we're cleaning it up. It's feeling better. I think there's a couple more things we can definitely do to make this better. And in particular, I think that on every single component you write, you should have a method. You can call it whatever you want, but basically a method to set the state, to kind of like update the elements that are involved in this to reflect some state of your element. And in the case of a toggle, the state's really simple. It's either on or off, right? So it's a Boolean value. The state is on and off. But in a lot of components, the state might be more complex than that. You could have, for example, you could have like a sortable where it's a list that you're ordering, and the state might be like, this is the first item, this is the second item, this is the third item. And so your set state method would like go and update the order of all those items. But in this case, it should be actually pretty easy because we're basically just going to say, okay, the state is either on or off. But what we want to do to reflect that state is the same thing we've been doing since we very first created this toggle. Right? The only two things you really do in a toggle is you set the buttons aria expanded and you toggle the class on the target. That's really the only things that we have to do to reflect the state of on or off, is toggle the target class and set that aria expanded. So let's separate those out into a method. We can just call it set state like so. And that's going to need both the button, the target, and the current state, which is we could just call is toggled. So that's going to allow us to set the button's state, set the target state, and it's going to accept either a true or a false for is toggled. And so in our JS doc block, we'll have an HTML element button, which is the toggle button. We'll have an HTML element target, which is the toggle target. And we'll have a Boolean is toggled for new, let's call it new toggle state, just to be very clear that that's the new state that you're entering. And then we'll say set toggle state. And now that we have this set state, this is going to be so good. Just wait till you guys see what we do here. We'll basically set the button state and the target state. That's the only two things we need to do. And let's just come down here and we'll copy. Let me put my cursor here and here. Oh, and they're going to be in the wrong order, so we're going to have to move this guy down here. There we go. And so we actually already have a variable called is toggled here, so we're going to set aria expanded to is toggled. And in this case, we can't use the dot toggle because now we're accepting either a true or a false, so we're not just always going to toggle the class list. So what we can do is there's class list.add as well as class list.remove. So those are two methods we could use to do whether it's true or false. So we could just say is toggled, and if that's truthy, use add, otherwise use remove. So that'll do the same thing. It's either going to add or remove the this.config.toggle class from the target element. And now that we have this set state thing, we can come down here. And down here, what we'll do is let's take this out, this toggle the target class, and let's take out the set button. and we'll replace that with set toggle state, and that's going to be this.set state button target is toggled. And I think we should still be good in this case. So again, it's going to do all the same thing. Oh, did our blur method? Yeah, it worked. I think I dragged the photo, which will cancel. It won't blur in that case. But yeah, everything's looking good at this point. So we totally separated out our set state, which again, I think is so important for every component you create, not just a toggle, but you should always have a method when you're creating, at least in this pattern, when you're creating a web interaction like this, you should always have a method that is going to accept basically the HTML elements that it should care about, or maybe just a parent element and then use traversal to find all the elements or whatever, however you want to handle that. But it's basically, it should be able to say, hey, here's our DOM elements and here's our state. Now update the DOM based on that new state. And you're going to find that's going to come in handy in so many situations. And not the least of which is that just by doing this, we can now eliminate that very ugly pattern I did before where we did this dot collapse single siblings equals true and false. Like I never wanted to do that. I really always hated that because we now no longer need to trigger an active button dot click. We no longer need to invoke a click on the button because we now have a separate method that is going to allow us to set the state independent of whether or not a click has happened. And that's really, really useful. So we now don't have to do this really nasty stuff up here. Instead of doing that, I can say, because in this case we are dismissing siblings, I could simply say for each active button, this.setState active button, and then say this.getTarget active button. And actually, let me leave this in its own. We could do a one-liner, but just for the sake of brevity, let's put this on its own line. So we're saying this.setState was going to accept a button, which is the active button. It's going to accept a target, which we already have a getTarget method, and then it's going to accept a new state is toggled. But in this case, we want to dismiss them, so we can simply set the new state to false. And then check this out. Now that we've done that, the single is still going to work, but I didn't have to invoke a click. I didn't have to do any of that weird stuff with dispatching events, which was easy, especially if you have a really simple component. It's very easy to just say like button.click when you have a toggle to toggle it on and off. But this is actually what I would argue is the right way to do it, is that you have a set state method, and the set state method can do all the stuff it needs to do. You don't need to rely on some toggle thing. You can just say, here's the new state, and then everything just works. And that's how you want it to work. I think that's going to be a much better pattern to use. And as you can see, yet again, we've simplified our code. We've reduced the amount of code we had to do here and really made this a lot easier to use in this case, in my opinion. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you remember, this getTarget method could potentially return null. And that could be an issue because what's happening is when we're passing that off to this.setState, the second argument here could potentially be null. So what we probably want to do as well, and also it is going to make this method a little more flexible, so maybe you only want to individually set the state of one or the other element for some reason. Just simply put before each of these lines, if button, then set the button's attribute, and if target, set the target's attribute. And that's just going to make this a little more friendlier. In general, it should work like that. That would only be the case if you misconfigured something and it's going to be broken anyway, right? Because you didn't configure it right. But nonetheless, this will prevent an error from actually occurring, and the user will still be able to see that something has gone wrong because it's not going to work. All right, and finally, the last thing I want to do while we're refactoring here is I think we kind of have two things going on here. We still have quite a bit of code inside of our toggle method. And I think, again, there's really two things going on. We have, first of all, we're handling the click, right? That's one thing that is going on. We're saying, is it not a toggle button? Let's prevent the default click. Let's find the button. Those are all things that, in my opinion, are what I would call the click handler. And that's separate from what we're doing below here, which is once we actually have the button, let's work on toggling the button. So I would argue that you actually have two different things going on in this toggle method. So what I'd like to do is let's actually rename this method. I'm going to use the F2 to do the rename symbol or whatever that command is in Visual Studio Code. And we'll change this to toggle click perhaps. And so that's going to be a click handler where we're going to check to see if it's not a toggle button. We will, and this is going to return void. And we'll change the description up here to be toggle button click listener. And we will get the button. And then once we've gotten the button, let's take all this other stuff that's in here. Let's cut that out and we'll say toggle the button. And that'll do something like this dot toggle button. And we haven't created that method yet, the this dot toggle, because we renamed this to toggle click. But you'll see up here, if we add that method toggle and we'll accept a button, then we can paste all this stuff in here. That's going to keep it nice and separated. We can give this a JS doc block. So that's going to take an HTML element button, which is the toggle button. This will return void. And this is toggle the state of given button. And so this method will simply handle kind of the logic of what a toggle is. So we're going to say, let's get the toggle target. Let's call this get current state, because that's a little more applicable in this case, because we now have a set state method. And we can take out this yucky collapsing single siblings thing, because we're no longer doing that. So we're saying, are you expand only? If so, let's simply return. And in this case, this is a single option. So if is toggled and this .config.single. And I would say just to keep it the same as up here above, let's put that one first. And then we're setting the toggle state down here and firing the on toggle event. And all of that is now, again, nicely separated into this toggle method, which can simply accept a button. And then it's going to handle all the logic that we need to do all of our options like expand only, single, etc. But this is going to be so much easier to follow, right? I'm not muddying the water with our filtering out of other clicks and stuff like that. All that is handled in our click handler down here, where it's going to check all that stuff, prevent the default click, find the button, and then it's just going to pass it off once we're ready to actually toggle the button to the toggle method itself. And then once again, you'll see everything is working just the same as before, but we've really cleaned up our code at this point, and it's looking so much better. And before we wrap it up, let's just scroll down and make sure we have a nice finished, make sure that our other listeners and our other methods down here don't need to be cleaned up any. But so this one, just for the sake of consistency, since we're calling this toggle click, I'll call this blur click. And again, you can use F2 to rename a symbol. And when you use that method, it'll rename it up here too. If we go all the way to the top where we're adding our listeners, notice how it's updated here as well. But there's our blur click, and we'll just call this blur blick. I just typed blick. That's so weird. Blur click listener. And that will return void. And we'll call this the blur click event. There we go. So we're saying blur is not enabled. We're getting the active buttons. We are getting the toggle container, and then we're blurring if the active container contains e.target. I think all that looks pretty good. And actually, in this case, we're invoking a click again. We don't need to do that. We can simply say this.toggle active button, because again, we separated out our toggle functionality and we no longer need to invoke click. So I think that will actually help as well. And let's just make sure our blurs still work. They sure do. So now we no longer need to invoke that click thing that we've been doing this whole time. And then finally, let's just double check our key listener down here. So we're checking for keyboard control, getting the closest container. I would say this could go to a one-liner now, since we shortened that with this.get active buttons. That's looking good. So there's our escape key. Here's our navigate with arrow keys, which we already redid with our get Focusables thing. That's all looking good. And yeah, I think that's going to do it. That's going to finish up our refactor, which hopefully you'll see the benefit of that. We really kind of improved this quite a bit. We still have all the same functionality as before, but we separated everything out into these nice sort of utility class methods like getTarget, getActive buttons, getFocusables. And now in the future, if we ever need to do something like dismiss all the siblings or set the state or whatever, we have a separate method in order to do that. And we don't have to do weird stuff like we were doing before where we set temporary class properties and just kind of mess with all that stuff. So this is definitely more advanced. This is why we sort of waited until this point in the course to do this, because this is kind of creating a much more advanced pattern for your web interactions, but it's going to be better in the long run. If you can wrap your head around what we did and how we created this separation of concerns with all these different methods in this class, it's going to end up being like kind of a longer file, but it's actually a lot easier to read and to follow, because not only do we have good documentation at this point, but again, that separation concerns sets up your code in such a way that each method is really only worried about a single thing, which is going to be a lot less error prone. It's going to be a lot easier for you to maintain because you're going to know exactly what's going on at any given time. And it's going to be a lot easier for other people to work with as well. And I certainly hope you agree. I hope you enjoyed refactoring the code with me. In the next lesson, we'll actually use this refactored code and see how that having separated this out is going to benefit us in developing other web interactions in our applications.